G'day, in this video we're going to be talking about the difference between DSLR style cameras and the newer, more modern mirrorless cameras to help you make a decision over which one may be better for you. And believe it or not, the decision is not crystal clear. There's a lot of points to cover, so let's crack into it. Okay, well firstly to start off, let me say that both systems use interchangeable lenses and are both capable of capturing extremely high quality professional images. Now DSLR cameras are the traditional style of camera that you may be used to. Some would say they're older tech, but in no way are they less capable than their newer, more modern mirrorless cousins. In reality, the DSLR camera has a variety of systems for a variety of functions. For instance, it has a separate system for autofocus and auto exposure, as well as for capturing the image. Whereas the mirrorless camera, by virtue of its name having removed the mirror box in front of the sensor, requires the sensor to carry out all those jobs. So from the point of view of having one system per job, some would say the DSLR is in fact a lot more capable from that point of view. But before we go too much further in this, let me just say that the fundamental difference outside of the technical differences are the size and weight. By virtue of the name mirrorless camera, it implies that the mirrored box in front of the image sensor has been removed entirely, and that allows the camera to actually be a lot more compact and also a lot more lightweight. And that essentially is why mirrorless cameras have come about, to make a smaller, more lightweight, more portable camera system. And even on that point, both systems will offer you the ability to capture high quality photos by enabling great low light performance, image detail and color, as well as shallow depth of field. Both of them will perform very well in all those applications. But if we are starting with size and weight, it is important to note that mirrorless cameras tend to have smaller batteries, and therefore they have lesser battery life. In most DSLRs, you may get between 600 to 800 shots per battery charge, whereas on mirrorless cameras this is severely limited, more in about the 250 to 350 shot range. So if long battery life is important to you, the DSLR wins out on this point. I also personally tend to find that the DSLR camera seems to be more durable and hardy. So I usually prefer to take a DSLR camera in more active or potentially rugged applications. Another main difference is that the DSLR camera tends to have a viewfinder and a live view screen, whereas a mirrorless camera may only have a live view screen and may not have a viewfinder at all. And if it does have a viewfinder, it will be an electronic viewfinder. Now I personally love the electronic viewfinder because it gives you a true preview of the photo you're about to take, including the exposure. But except in the most highest quality of mirrorless cameras, it can have a slight lag or a bit of latency between the image you're seeing and what's actually happening in front of the camera. Whereas the optical viewfinder gives you a true to life, real life view of what's actually happening right in front of you at that very moment, and allows you to possibly connect more reliably with your subject and what's happening in front of the camera. One thing that I also find in my experience is that the electronic viewfinder tends to struggle a lot in extremely low light, whereas in the optical viewfinder you can still sort of make out what's happening in front of the camera and pull manual focus if you need to. That is a situation where the electronic viewfinder lags behind quite a lot. It simply cannot preview the image as to the exposure you want pre-flash without pre-lighting the scene. So from that point of view, when it's extremely low light conditions, I often find myself reverting to using the DSLR optical viewfinder. Back to the electronic viewfinder, it can make it really good for learning how to shoot in manual mode because you're able to adjust the settings and see how it's going to affect the final image immediately right in front of you, right in your eye. But having said that, with experience, the optical viewfinder, you're able to visualize your final exposure by use of the built-in light meter. And not only that, the DSLR camera does still have the live view screen, so you kind of get the best of both worlds from that point of view. Both of these systems offer excellent focusing ability, which wasn't always true. But in recent years, mirrorless tech has advanced so much that the difference between the two is now mainly indistinguishable. Optical viewfinders do have an advantage that's particularly relevant for sports and action photographers. There is an unavoidable screen blackout in the camera's burst shooting mode as the mirror flips up and down between exposures, but this is rarely an issue. The key point here is that there is no lag, and it's much easier to follow a fast-moving subject than it is with the average mirrorless camera. And not only that, many photographers actually prefer the naked eye view of an optical viewfinder over a digital rendition. Now, optical viewfinders also have the ability to illuminate LED overlays, so they can actually overlay more information between you and your subject. Things like the rule of thirds, or things like a level, or actually show you the available focus points. Okay, well if we jump ahead now to access to lenses, most manufacturers will have native lenses for both the DSLR models and also for the mirrorless models. And pretty much all systems will allow you to to adapt the DSLR lenses to the newer mirrorless bodies, but in most cases you won't be able to adapt lenses designed specifically for mirrorless cameras back to the DSLR. So that could be a bit of a consideration as well, based on the number of lenses you may already own or the amount of lenses available in the second-hand market. One thing that I find in my experience as well is that although it's expected that most DSLR lenses which you adapt to the mirrorless camera will still be able to function as expected in things such as autofocus speed, time to focus on subject, there can actually be a little bit of difficulty when the lens is required to focus deep into the focus distance range. So if you're going from close focus to far focus, sometimes the mirrorless camera with the DSLR adapted lens can become confused and become paralyzed, and you'll have to use manual focus override to shunt it into the range of where it's going to be able to acquire that autofocus. And speaking of lenses, it also pays to note at this point, while mirrorless bodies tend to be smaller and more compact, the same cannot be said about the lenses themselves. Of course, you are able to get compact lenses for mirrorless systems. There are some available out there, but you only have to look at the really chody Canon mirrorless lenses to see that in some cases they are the same size as the DSLR variants, if not even bigger. Another quick point on lenses is that the second-hand market is overflowing with DSLR lenses. They tend to be a lot cheaper, there tends to be a much wider range, you tend to be able to pick them up for a lot less money as mentioned, and it gives you access to a wider variety of lens possibilities. Okay, let's jump to video modes. Now, when shooting video on a DSLR, it requires you to switch into a dedicated video mode and activate the live view screen in order to be able to take videos. Whereas with a mirrorless camera, you can often shoot video directly from whatever mode you're in. And not only that, you can shoot video using the viewfinder. And I find using the electronic viewfinder for shooting video makes your final video much more steady as you're able to lock the camera into your eye and keep it there. In terms of focusing for video, now with the technology gap closing between DSLR and mirrorless cameras, there's not a lot of difference there. They both perform really, really well. I would not be too phased to take video with either the DSLR or the mirrorless system. But in reality, the best video I get is out of my mirrorless EOS R, and the video out of this mirrorless M50 is absolutely sensational, far superior to what I get out of the DSLR 80D. If you're primarily a video shooter, then mirrorless is probably going to be the way to go for you. But if you're primarily a photographer or photographer/videographer, there's still a lot of benefits in shooting with the DSLR. Look, just to hone in on this point for the video, DSLRs can shoot incredible video, amazing video for commercial, professional purposes, or just your amateur, your personal video shooting. Absolutely no worries at all. But the mirrorless camera may just offer you slight benefits, such as usually being able to use the EVF or just simply having a smaller, more compact video system. Let's jump into some other differences. One thing that I really like about the mirrorless camera is the electronic shutter or the silent shutter, which generally speaking will be much faster than the mechanical shutters as per in the DSLR, and also much faster than the mechanical shutters in the mirrorless camera themselves. The silent shutter is terrific as well because it doesn't require the flapping of the mirror, which creates quite a lot of sound. It actually enables the camera to take photos completely silently. But I find the silent shutter still has a lot of way to go to catch up with a mechanical shutter. I find that it just doesn't quite keep up with fast or moving subjects, and it can result in banding throughout your images. And also you can't use other accessories on the camera such as a speed light. In most cases, in situations where I need to use a silent shutter, it won't work because there is incandescent or LED lighting which causes banding, or I need to use a speed light to improve the light, and of course it won't trigger with the silent shutter. So the only real time I can use a silent shutter is in outdoor well-lit situations without fast-moving subjects. If there are fast-moving subjects, I often find the image can skew or have some strange dimensions across it, or you can see the effects of rolling shutter even in still photography. The reality is electronic shutter is great, silent shutter is good, but nothing beats the mechanical shutter. The mechanical shutter is the most reliable in terms of preventing banding, for being able to use things like flicker detection, and also for being able to use a speed light or other accessories of that nature on your camera. If we think about the controls briefly, now, generally speaking, all DSLRs will have fully manual controls. They tend to have a lot more buttons and the ability to manually make changes to the settings on the body of the camera itself. Whereas mirrorless cameras tend to have fewer controls and require you to delve into menus or touch screens more often in order to change the settings. And that can be an obstacle to changing the settings quick enough to be able to get the shot that you need to get. So from that point of view, if I need a really functional, flexible system, depending on the job, I will reach for the DSLR cameras because I know that I can just feel along and find the controls that I'm used to. and not have to look down or take my eyes off the action like I would do in a mirrorless camera in order to be able to change the settings. One thing I did mention a moment ago was the closing the gap between the technologies of the two. And if we were talking about this exact thing a couple of years ago, it'd be much easier for me to espouse the advantages over one system over the other, such as the DSLR being better than the mirrorless. But as that gap closes, it's really hard to distinguish between which one is going to be better in which case. And as more of the features from the traditional DSLR are put into the mirrorless camera and perform really competently, it's getting even more increasingly difficult to decide. One thing I do find about the mirrorless cameras, however, these days is they tend to have edge to edge of the frame focus points, whereas DSLRs, and particularly the more earlier models, tend to have all of the focus points clumped more into the center, and it is harder to reach to the outsides of the frame to be able to get focus on objects that are near to the edges. So that does require you to focus recompose a lot more on DSLR cameras than it might do when using mirrorless cameras. Okay, one of the last points of difference that I want to cover before we conclude here is the price. Now, you will find there is a massive difference in the price depending on what sort of range of cameras you're looking at. If you're looking at entry-level or intermediate cameras, the DSLRs are going to be significantly cheaper than the mirrorless variants because of the accessibility and the number of models that are on the market. There's just truly a huge plethora of DSLR cameras on the market, and most importantly in the second-hand segment. For instance, here in New Zealand, for $250, which is probably like 160 American dollars, you can get yourself a full setup ready to shoot, but you'll be really hard pressed to find that for a mirrorless camera. I guess it comes down to the fact that mirrorless cameras are more modern, so therefore that's likely to be more expensive. Even though you may think that being more compact and more lightweight may in fact result in being cheaper, that's not really true. But I personally think the main reason is because of the strength of the second-hand market. There's so many cameras out there available in the DSLR models to pick up for small change that makes it still a really appealing and attractive prospect for people who don't want to plunge thousands of dollars into a hobby that they may not necessarily wish to spend that much on. Once again, the point applies that the gap between the prices on DSLR and mirrorless cameras is closing. But in general terms, you're going to get more bang for your buck buying DSLR, particularly if you're buying secondhand. Okay, we're going to get ready to conclude now, and just a point to say that there may actually only be one or two properties out of the things that we've talked about that lead you to think that one system is going to be better than the other. If you're looking to the future and you want to have the latest of the greatest, the mirrorless cameras is probably the way to go, but they're still not necessarily quite there in terms of the functionality and reliability and durability of the DSLR cameras. As far as I'm concerned, if I'm shooting in more challenging situations, extreme low light, or I need to make sure I can rely on getting the shot, then I will reach for the DSLR camera. Mainly for all the manual controls, the accessibility of the controls, and the fact that I can use the unobstructed optical viewfinder in order to check for focus before firing the shot. If I want to trust the camera that I'm going to be using and I have to get the shot, the DSLR is the way to go for me. Okay, well, we're nearly done, so let's talk about when to choose a DSLR camera. DSLRs still have advantages over mirrorless cameras. They're bigger, fatter, chunkier, and more grippable. They handle better with bigger lenses, and they have more space for external controls, meaning you spend less time poking around inside menus with your head down, missing the action that's out there in front of you that you need to be capturing. They have optical viewfinders, and I'll tell you what, hardcore photographers or DSLR fans would vow to never swap the optical viewfinder for an electronic viewfinder. It's just that what they prefer mostly, and to be honest, I really like the optical viewfinder. But if I flip that, I really love the EVF too, so I can't split the two on that point alone. We talked about the budget. If you're on a tight budget, DSLR is the way to go. You're going to get a cheaper, better second-hand camera for less money. It's just undeniable, there's just no doubt about it. Remembering, of course, that all DSLR cameras have viewfinders, but many mirrorless cameras don't. And shooting off the live view screen is actually an art in itself. I tend to shoot mainly with the viewfinder, but at times I find myself shooting with the live view screen if I need more access or to shoot from different angles. But in reality, as a photographer first, I tend to use the optical viewfinder most in order to connect best with my subject and also to be able to check around the frame to see what you're going to get in the shot. Look, the bottom line is there's so much going for mirrorless cameras which may make you lean towards them as your preference, but DSLR cameras are a great choice because they're chunky, they're physical, you can feel them, you can change the controls, you can rely on them, they're durable, you can drop them, ideally not, but you can. They just seem to me to be more trustworthy, and I can rely on the DSLR more than I can the mirrorless camera. Yep, when it comes to video, DSLRs can do video. They can do great video. If you're a videographer first, probably going to look towards a mirrorless camera, but if you're a photographer first or you're split down the middle, then the DSLR is a great prospect and definitely should not be discounted simply on the basis that the mirrorless camera is more modern and more advanced. Okay, when to choose mirrorless cameras? Well, as we said right at the start, mirrorless cameras are much more compact, smaller, they're more lightweight. And if you choose them quite carefully, you can get smaller lenses to go with them. Although in many cases the lenses are about the same size, if not bigger, than the DSLR variants. For posting on things like social media, the mirrorless cameras like this EOS M50 here are great because they're so small, but they can still take extremely high quality professional images. Okay, and on the point of video again, if you're a pro or a semi-pro videographer, then mirrorless cameras are probably the way to go. That is where all the development is going into for video production these days in terms of cameras, lenses, hardware and accessories, and it's all happening now. So look, if you're a photographer first, then both systems are going to be completely adequate for you. The more professional you are, however, the more you're most likely to lean towards the DSLR for that reliability. You can trust it. If you're a videographer or video first, then you're probably going to go towards a mirrorless camera simply because of the features such as the EVF and the higher resolutions that they may offer you. Okay, well, we've been going for quite a while here and I'm not exactly sure whether or not that will have enabled you to work out which is better for you, being the DSLR or the mirrorless camera. But basically, the market is heading towards mirrorless cameras, so there's a lot to be said for starting out into that system or transitioning into that system if you currently shoot DSLR. But even that all being said, DSLRs are still hugely popular. They are still making new ones. There are still a whole lot of modern DSLRs out there available for you. There are a lot of people who would love to shoot with mirrorless cameras, and a lot of people are buying mirrorless cameras these days. But DSLRs are still hugely popular and cheaper, and with a greater range of second-hand options out there in the market right now. So they're still an extremely appealing and attractive option. When it comes to me personally, I probably cannot see myself buying another DSLR body, but every single job I do, I take a mirrorless camera and I take the DSLR. In extreme low light situations, I will shoot more of the DSLR simply because I can see through the viewfinder and it's not all black because the scene is all black. And it enables me to be able to get focus, potentially manually, without having to pre-fire a flash and distract the whole scene that I'm about to photograph. So that's a really relevant point for me. So yeah, all that being said, while they're both extremely competent systems, for now the DSLR still does a few things really excellently that the mirrorless camera can't quite do. As I've mentioned a number of times, however, the technology gap between the two is closing very rapidly and very fast. So I, for one, am extremely interested to see what happens over the next few years and to see what happens with the DSLR camera as mirrorless cameras continue to improve and get better. But as things continue to improve and get better, they tend to get more expensive as well. So if budget is a primary consideration for you, then DSLR is the way to go now and probably the way to go tomorrow. Okay, so to wrap up, look, basically if they were automobiles, I would say the DSLR would be my pickup truck, whereas my mirrorless camera would be the more sporty car. I can use my pickup truck in a much more wider range of situations than I can the sports car, but it's just a hell of a lot of fun driving a sports car. Okay, so that was quite a deep dive into the difference between DSLR cameras and mirrorless cameras in order to help you decide which one may be better for you. And I'm not exactly sure if you're going to be able to out of this whole video, but that just illustrates the point that the gap between the two is a lot closer. And I've been saying it this whole video than what it was when the mirrorless cameras first came out. I hope all that helps in some way. And if you do have any other additional questions, let me know. I'll be happy to answer them based on my experience. And in the meantime, thanks for watching and we'll catch you on the next one.